In this video, I'll demonstrate how to send a user ID and password authentication. In this video, I'll demonstrate how to use user ID and password authentication to the EDS API. If you have not already watched our video on authenticating to the EDS API using the IP address, it is highly recommended that you do that first, because what is in this video is often not required if your application lives on a server that's within the IP ranges of your university. This method is really only used when the IP address of your application may vary. So for example, if you're designing an iPhone app where the code itself lives on the iPhone, which may have any number of IP addresses. With that in mind, let's go ahead and proceed. Unlike IP-based authentication, the EDS API will not respond to your application unless you authenticate using user ID and password. Here, what you'll likely want to do is store your user ID and password in a non-web accessible file that your script can get to. Here I've designed a function called getAuthenticationToken. Whenever that's called, what it does first is it looks at a text file called token.txt, and it grabs an auth token, a timeout, and a timestamp from that file. It evaluates that token to see if it has expired. And if it hasn't, it simply returns that authentication token as the return of the function itself. In that way, we are not calling for a new authentication token if we already have a good one in that token.txt file. It's important to note that all users of your application can use that same authentication token until it expires. You do not have to generate a new authentication token for each and every user, and in fact, it is advised against that. If it is determined that the token that's in that text file is invalid, you will want to make an API call to get a new one, and then store that one that you get back in that token.txt file. So let's step through that request. Here, the endpoint for making a UID auth request is shown. You can also find this on the EDS wiki. In the body of that request, you'll want to include your user ID and password. Here I'm pulling that from a config file that's not web accessible. Once I submit that request, the response I get back will include an authentication token. And here I'm storing that new authentication token as well as a timeout and a timestamp in that token.txt file, overwriting the expired one that was there. And then finally, I return the valid authentication token. So in sum, this getAuthenticationToken function will either A, return the valid token that exists in the token.txt file, or B, make a call for a new authentication token, store it in the token.txt file, and that's the token that it returns. That authentication token must be used on every request you make to the API subsequently. This generally goes in the header of your requests. So for example, the next logical step would be to generate a new session token if it's a new user. Here's our request to the session, the create session method. And what you'll notice is in the headers of this request, I'm including our authentication token. Again, don't forget to include the authentication token on each and every request, including search and retrieve and create session for your application. As a final reminder, this method is only required if your application does not live within the IP ranges of your university.